Welcome back to the shop, everyone. This week's video takes place in 2023, week 25, June 19th, June 25th. And we are starting off by getting the scatter shield pulled off the engine. We're also pulling the starter off. And the reason why we're doing that is because the flywheel that I'm going to actually use on this engine came in. So I can now pull off that test flywheel and put the proper one on. So I'm just using a ratchet to try and get these bolts off, but of course they're torqued up, and even with the breaker bar on there, because of the way the breaker bar is going, that's just loosening the bolt on the crank. So due to the amount of force required and the fact I can't do it with hand tools, I just said screw it, and I grabbed my impact and I just break them all free and go from there. This new McLeod flywheel comes with two different weights, as you can see. There's a smaller weight, which is the 28 ounce, and then there is the larger weight, which is the 50 ounce. And for my application, I need the 50 ounce. Of course, if you have an internally balanced engine, you can run without any weight, and then you have a 0 ounce flywheel. So I could also use this flywheel on the next engine that I'm going to build for the car, because that should be internally balanced. So it's just reading the instructions, and what I'm going to do is I want to clean the bolts off, and I also want to Loctite them on. Yeah, so I also need to clean off the flywheel. It's got packing material on it to prevent it from rusting. So a little bit of brake clean it all off, a little bit of Loctite on the bolts, and then tighten them up. So I'm just going to clean off the face, and just a bit of warning while I'm installing this flywheel, I, like an idiot, get my fingers underneath it and get them pinched between the flywheel and the floor, so it causes my finger to bleed a little bit. So if you are squeamish in any way or don't like the sight of blood, I do give you a heads up as to when it's happening and to tell you to skip ahead. But yeah, just a heads up, there's a bit of blood in here. I mean, blood happens when you're building a car. So, you know, if you're watching this, you've probably built a car or are building a car and have, you know, scraped yourself. But yeah, just in case. Alright, now that all the blood's out of the way, I'm going to grab my book of, what are those? Instructions? Yeah, my book of instructions, and I'm just trying to make sure I have all of the right stuff for the bolts, so I got to put a little bit of the ARP high torque molly under the bolt head, and then a little bit of Loctite on the threads, and that's how you install these flywheel bolts. And with all of those started, we can now torque these down to spec. So now that we have the proper flywheel installed, we can start installing the clutch. This is starting to get exciting. With the clutch on, after I get the clutch on, I can work on, well, you're going to see in this video. You'll see what I'm going to work on. The flywheel came with these 3 little dowel pins that need to get installed, so I don't know of a better way to install them, so I just kind of beat them in. The bottom one started going in a little bit crooked, so I kind of restarted it and eventually get it in. I get all 3 in at the end, no big deal. So this is a McLeod Racing RXT 1000 dual disc clutch. So that means that there are 2 friction plates. So that right there is the bottom friction plate that goes between the adapter ring, I believe it's called, and the flywheel. Then the adapter ring goes on. It just loosely mounts onto those 3 dowels right now. And then I'm going to bolt it in afterwards. So it's at this point I noticed there is a washer missing from one of those studs, one of the 6 studs on the adapter ring. If you go back in, look a few seconds, you'll see that there was only 5 washers and not 6. So I'm searching the floor, I'm searching the bench, I'm wondering where it went. I didn't realize these were on there and that I had to pay attention to them. But if you go back even further in the video to where I was pulling this out of the box, there's a couple of frames where you'll see that shim was missing from the factory. So my thought process is, they probably balanced this thing from the factory. Maybe it wasn't needed. So since it was missing in the video, I'm just going to continue on. I have since called McLeod Racing, and they have told me, no, that is not supposed to be missing. You are supposed to have shims on all 6 of those studs, so they are actually sending me out a shim pack. It hasn't arrived yet, but it should be here in the next few days, I hope. But yeah, so Turns out it was just missing from the factory. It sucks because the entire build is kind of on hold until I get that now. But, you know, it is what it is. McLeod Racing, awesome customer service. Thanks, Billy, which is who I talked to over there. Did a fantastic job. And, you know, I'm happy with the customer service from them. So, as usual, I'm just cleaning off all of the hardware for mounting this, just in some mineral spirits. The reason why I'm continuing on with this install right now is because I actually went back, once I noticed that one shim was missing, I looked for it, I couldn't find it, and I actually went back to the GoPro video right away and noticed that it wasn't there from the factory. So I was like, okay, I can continue on. It wasn't there from the factory. It's probably not a big deal. And then I had a nagging feeling, so that's when I called McLeod just to make sure that it was supposed to be missing, and turns out it's not. So we're just going to get this mounted up, and we're going to do some test fitting and make sure everything is lining up and nothing's binding, and it all looks good, even though it's all going to have to come back off. Alright, so what I'm doing is I'm putting the scatter shield back on, and the reason why I'm doing that is I need to measure the distance between the face of the bell housing and one of the clutch fingers. And the reason why I need to measure that is that'll tell me how far from the transmission the release bearing or throwout bearing, you can use them kind of interchangeably, needs to sit. So I need to take a measurement from the face of the bell housing down to the teeth on the clutch. So what I'm doing is I'm taking a straight edge, putting it up against the bell housing, and then using my calipers against the straight edge to give me the number. So it was really hard to get an accurate reading because it's hard for me to make sure that that's squares at a 90. So what I did is I just took my magnetic base, put it on the face of the bell housing, and then that gives me a perfect 90 to the bell housing, and I can use my digital calipers to get the depth measurement, easy peasy. In the instructions, they say what you do is you take that measurement, you minus 0.125 of an inch off of it, and that's how much of a gap you're supposed to have between the face of the release bearing and the clutch. So I'm also measuring the size of the square, even though I don't actually need to because I'm going to use the square on the transmission side as well. So I didn't really need to minus that, but I did. Yeah, so we're going to pull out the release bearing now, start working on getting it installed onto the transmission, and we're going to go from there. So what I want to do before I put the throw-up bearing on there is I just want to blow the whole tranny off with air because there was some like cardboard remnants left from shipment. So just clean it all off, make it so we have a nice clean surface. So I'm just taking a tiny little bit of grease and putting it on the inside of the throwout bearing to hopefully help it slide onto the transmission a little bit better. But before we do that, I knocked over the hydraulic jack fluid and it made a mess. The top popped off somehow. I'm not sure how, but it is what it is. We'll just clean this up quickly. Okay, back over to the transmission. So here you can see I already have a spacer installed against the transmission. This release bearing told me that I was required to use that spacer on a T56. So that's what I've done. So you can see there's a threaded insert, and what's going to happen is that threaded insert is going to press up against that spacer, and then depending on how far onto the release bearing you thread it is how far off of the transmission it's going to be. So as you can see, I'm taking that square again, I'm putting it up against the shaft of the transmission, and I am measuring from the front of the release bearing to the face of the transmission. So that's going to tell me how far from essentially the other mating surface this release bearing is sitting. I know that's a very hard concept to understand, but if you think about it, I first measured from the face of the scatter shield to the teeth. So the face of that scatter shield is going to mate up with the face of the transmission here. So those surfaces are pretty much exactly the same. So if I measure from the face of the release bearing to the face of the transmission, I know how deep that is in the scatter shield. And I want to make it so that that release bearing is 1/8 of an inch away from the teeth. So essentially what I'm doing is I took the measurement that I had on the scatter shield, I minus 1/8 of an inch, and that's what I need to be at here. So just by screwing the release bearing, up and down, you can change how far it comes from the transmission. All right, now that I have the proper height set, I can start working on the anti-roll stud. So as you saw, as I was working on it, I was just freely spinning the throwout bearing, and that was causing it to, either increase the distance from the transmission or decrease it. Well, what's going to happen is without this anti-roll stud, that release bearing is always going to try and turn itself. It won't be able to because there's going to be the clutch cables holding it, but you don't want to put a ton of force on those cables. So we just install this stud. The release bearing slides over the stud, and then it can't rotate. So throw a little bit of Loctite on the stud just to make sure it doesn't go anywhere. Tighten it down, and then you can see there's a little provision in the release bearing. It just goes right over the stud. We need to make sure that the stud, the reason why I had to cut the stud down is we want to make sure that that stud does not protrude past the face of the release bearing. And since I've pulled the release bearing and played with it a little bit, I'm just doing another double check to make sure we're still in tolerance. And I'm going to figure out something to do with the lines later, but before I can really figure that out, I need to put this engine back up to the transmission, and then I can figure out where to route the lines from there. All right, so release bearings in, clutch has been measured, we are rocking. So that right there is a fitting that is, you always want the bleeder on the top. So you'll have the pressure line on the bottom and you will bleed it out the top. Air rises, so you want all of the air to go to the top, and then that way it can come out. Alright, so now that that's done, what I can do is I can come back onto the engine. I'm going to pull the scatter shield off, I'm going to pull the clutch off, and I am actually going to index this bell housing. I got the indexing plate in, so I can actually do that properly now. So the clutch is going to stay off until I get that shim pack from McLeod, because there's really nothing else I can do. I can't reinstall it. But fortunately, I don't want it installed for checking the indexing of the bell housing, so it was coming off anyways, one way or another. Alright, and there is the first look at the indexing plate. So as you can see, it's got a perfect circle in the middle. This is specifically designed for the T56 bell housing. There's two dowels that go into the bell housing, and then you bolt it on with 3 bolts, and then that should be directly in the middle of that scatter shield. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my dial indicator. I'm going to attach the magnetic base onto the flywheel. I'm going to get the dial in position on the indexing plate, and then I'm going to find where the highest point is. And then what I'm going to do after I find the highest point on the plate, I'm going to reset up the dial indicator in that position, set the gauge to 0, and then I'm going to check every 90 degrees how far out it is, and that'll tell me if I need to adjust the dowel pins or if I'm good to go. So right now I'm just going to give it a few spins just to make sure that, you know, the dial indicator stays on the belt or on the plate. No, there's no problems, and that everything is kind of free, and it is. Everything's good to go. Now, doing this just by yourself is very hard, so I do use a little bit of technology here. I use my phone and its camera, and I point it at the dial indicator just so I can see what's going on. You know, ideally, you'd have somebody else here helping you. And then what you could do is you're watching the dial indicator as somebody else is spinning it. But for me, I was able to do this on my own. It wasn't the most enjoyable process, but we got it done. Alright, so I found that that third mark was actually the highest point on the dial indicator as I was going by. So that is going to be my starting mark. So I'm going to remove all the other marks, and I will re-zero the dial indicator at that point. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to check, as I think I said, at 90 degrees, at 180 degrees, and at 270 degrees from there. So this is very easy to do. I just get my ratchet, I point it up straight, and then I clock it in 90 degrees. And then what I do is I make a mark on the indexing plate as to what it was. That was only 3 thou. So I do the same thing, put the ratchet back up straight, turn it 90 degrees, get a mark. Again, that's also 3 thousandths. And the final position, this was, if I recall correctly, it was half a thousandths, so 0.0005. And what that tells me is this thing is indexed perfectly. The bell housing is like perfectly centered. I don't need to change a thing. This does not need to move at all. So all of that waiting and all of that for, yeah, it's good to go. Send it. Now that we've got it indexed, we're just going to do a little bit of cleanup. And what do you do when you got nothing else to do? You get back on wiring, and there is still no shortage of that in this car. So what I'm about to do is I'm going to repin this connector. If you recall correctly, I had to unpin them all so that I could pull it through the firewall and then enlarging the hole in the firewall. On the plus side, I should never have to depin this to this extent again unless I'm like rewiring the car entirely or something. So yeah, let's watch me while I repin this, I guess. Now that the majority of that has all been repinned, I'm going to pull all of the numbered tape off of these. Fortunately, I numbered them all before I put them all back. That way I know exactly where they go. Now that I've got those all repinned, I'm just kind of standing around doing a little tiny bit of pondering, trying to figure out what I'm going to do next. And yeah, so what I decide on is I am going to double check my pinout. So I need my multimeter, I need a chunk of wire, and I am one by one going to go and check each of those pins and make sure that it lines up on the ECU as I have it pinned out on the actual connector. And you know, I double checked this once before, all the way through from the ECU all the way to the end of the engine harness side. So as long as I double check it right now, that gives me pretty good confidence that all of my wires are correct from the ECU all the way into the engine. I had run into a few issues along the way. I had, a couple of things labeled wrong on my sheet, but big ol' thumbs up. We are good to go. Now that connector's back in, we are going to move to the back of the car and we are going to work on getting this rear bumper cover in. The reason why I want the rear bumper cover on is because I need to install the, what is it? It's the pull switch to power the car. So essentially, if you go drag racing, you're supposed to have a switch on the back of the car that you can just hit to kill the car. So I need the back bumper cover on so I can put that on the car. I'm going to make it so that that's only going to work when I'm actually like going to the track type of thing. Other than that, I'll just have a little jumper and just make it so that the wires are live all the time. So I started putting the driver's side tail light on, and then I think halfway through I realized, wait a second, if I put this on, how does the bumper cover go on? So then I pull it back off and I pull the other light off as well. So yeah, with both lights out, I can put the bumper cover back on, bolt that in, and then I can put the lights in. Yeah, so with the bumper cover and the lights back on, I can figure out a place where I'm going to put the switch. And that's kind of what I'm doing now. And I'm putting it just directly under the reverse light on the passenger side, just kind of on a flat piece. Yeah, so that's done. The switch pulls and it pushes, and presumably once I connect the wires, it'll work. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to work on installing the reservoir for the clutch. So this is a hydraulic clutch. It uses technically brake fluid, but hydraulic fluid. So I'm going to mount the reservoir right on the front of the shock tower. And the reason why I want it on the front of the shock tower is I want it to be easy to access and put fluid in. If I put it on the firewall when the hood is up, it might be a little tight to get at and get fluid in. It probably would have been okay, but I just decided to put it on the front of the shock tower for now. I can always move it later if I want. I also don't know how much room there's going to be at the back on the firewall, so we'll see. I may end up moving it, who knows. I don't know what I was doing here, but I grabbed this drill bit case, I lift it up, I smash it on the bottom of the cupboards, and I just make a huge mess of all my drill bits, both in the case and out of the case, and I just don't feel like dealing with this right now. I don't have the energy. I'm just like, fuck it, I will deal with this later. I do not give a shit. Just let it go, let it be a mess, and quite likely I'll just throw them all in a bin. Yeah, it doesn't really matter that much to me. In any case, all that mess aside, I believe I'm drilling a 5/16 hole for the bolts for the reservoir. So obviously that hose that came with it is not long enough, so we're going to make our own PTFE lined hose for this. And as you can see, it's going to be black. It's actually the same make that all of my heater hose, my fuel line, and everything else is. But this has a lining on the inside and is rated up to either 2,500 or 3,000 PSI, which is perfect for a hydraulic system. Yeah, so I'm just putting the master cylinder for the brakes on so that I know how much space I have and where I can route the lines for this reservoir. So right now the clutch pedal and the brake booster are very loose, so I'm just throwing a couple of bolts on there tight to get the final position of the master and the brake booster, so I can, you know, make a educated decision on where I want to run the line. Making this line is very similar to all the lines that you've seen me make before. There is a difference though. This has like a plastic lining on the inside, and so there's a plastic lining, and then there's the steel braid, and then there's the nylon braid on the outside. So I do have a special tool that that goes inside the nylon, spreads all of the steel braid and nylon away from the plastic. And then this fitting has a little, I believe it's called a ferrule. It's a little piece of metal. It's specifically designed to go over the plastic insert and provide some strength. I think it's for strength, so that when you tighten down the fitting, it doesn't leak. So it is more or less the same process as it was on my fuel and my heater hoses, with the exception of using that special tool that's in my hand right now, just to get all of the braid and nylon away from the inner liner, and then putting the little metal ferrule on, which you'll see here in a second. Didn't really see it, but I did put it on there, and then you just tighten the fitting down like, you know, like all the other fittings. As usual, repeat the process on the other side. I'm guessing the GoPro ran out of battery or something, because I don't actually have video of me putting this line on the car. And so me putting this together is the last thing that we have in this video. So as always, if you stuck around this long, I'd like to thank you for viewing, and we'll catch you in the next one.